Good morning, or afternoon. I guess it depends on your time zone. I'm in Seattle, so we're at like 11:50 a.m., which is right on the cusp. Good morning, afternoon, evening, midday. Hi, folks. Thanks for popping in. Today we're just gonna chat a little bit about some of the hidden signs that you might need to set a boundary. I like to think of them as boundary setting signposts. So these signals in your body or in your mind or in your behavior that kind of serve as these blinking red lights that say, oh, boundary needed. We need one here. Because this is a question I get a lot from folks who are kind of just new stepping into the boundary setting work that we're all kind of doing together is, okay, how do I know I need to set a boundary? What's the signal? What's the sign? And if you're not accustomed to identifying your own needs or knowing where your limits are, it can actually be like a really serious question. Where do I begin? And so the first piece of advice I like to give folks who are contemplating that, trying to figure out where to begin, is identify your own personal boundary setting signposts. And just so you know, this is something we're going to talk about in detail tonight at my Empowered Boundary Setting workshop. It's happening at 5 p.m. Pacific time. I'm dropping the link in the notes. You should come. And if you can't make it live, you can always watch the on-demand recording on my website. All the info's at that link I just popped in there in the comments section. But yeah, so one of the boundary setting signposts, you all have probably thought a little bit about, anger being a sign you might need to set a boundary, right? That's kind of a more obvious one. Something else we talk about extensively here in like the Instagram realm is resentment being a great sign you need to set a boundary. But there are some hidden ones that are even more telling at times. The first one is avoidance. And I see someone asking, can I pin the link to that workshop real quick? So I am not sure how to pin it, but I'm just going to keep posting it over and over so you don't miss it. Just check, the link is in my bio on my page as well. But one of the signs is avoidance. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, how is avoidance a sign that I need to set a boundary? But think about it this way, right? If you find yourself consistently avoiding a person, a place, an institution, a community, that's probably some sort of sign that you don't feel comfortable around or within them, right? So maybe this takes the form of you always getting texts from the same person and just being like, oh God, I don't want to answer this right now. Or maybe it means that a certain community organization keeps sending you emails about being on the board and you just never reply to them. You completely avoid them because it overwhelms you, because you feel guilty, because you feel stressed. No matter the case, avoidance can be a really compelling sign that you need to set a boundary because something in you is so reticent to engage with that person or community that you would rather remove yourself and not go there. So ask yourself, with each of these, I'll kind of encourage a self-reflection. What person or people or community or even task, obligation, do you find yourself consistently avoiding in your own life? If you notice that one or more of those things gives you kind of like a sinking feeling or an avoidance feeling, you might be thinking to yourself, all right, this avoidance is a sign that I need to set a boundary. All right, so that's one of them. We're talking about the 4 hidden signs that you need to set a boundary here, y'all, and we will talk about all of these in detail tonight at my workshop, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. I just dropped the link in the chat if you would like to come hang out tonight or watch the on-demand recording. So the second sort of hidden signal that you might need to set a boundary is similar to avoidance, except it's a little bit more hardcore. The way I like to think about it. I like to think about it as ghosting, right? So avoidance and ghosting is kind of like avoidance to level 10. So this is complicated, right? Because many of us who are here in the world, not even just on this live, have been ghosted before, whether it's by a friend, whether it's by someone we're dating or some other relationship. And obviously it really freaking sucks to be ghosted by someone that we've begun to build a connection with. And maybe we too have ghosted. And this is something I notice a lot with folks who identify as recovering people pleasers, which is me and a lot of the folks I work with too, is that those of us who have trouble communicating directly about our needs and our limitations will find it sometimes easier to ghost and just completely remove ourselves from that dynamic because the thought of having that real talk conversation about our needs and our limitations stresses us out too much. It sounds so awful, it sounds so uncomfortable, it sounds so overwhelming that we would sooner just ghost and skedaddle than have that talk. I don't know if any of y'all resonate with that. Feel free to put a little wavy hand or a little comment in there, because I think this is the thing, right? When someone ghosts on us, of course it's natural to be, pissed or frustrated or just kind of like, what the hell? But I think when we can remember that when folks ghost, it's because they are struggling to communicate their own needs and boundaries and limitations, including us. This is why a lot of recovering people pleasers actually have a history, and maybe you're among them, of leaving kind of like a broken trail of relationships behind them. So maybe you have a history of, kind of skedaddling from even friendships, best friendships, relationships, and you look back at your history and you're like, why is this my tendency? Like, why do I have this tendency to cut people out? And just move on to the next thing. And if this resonates with you, this is a similar thing. This is the second hidden sign that you need to set a boundary. It's ghosting, right? Because if you, again, are not comfortable sitting down with a friend and having an intimate, vulnerable, real conversation about what your needs and limitations are, you're not going to feel like you can be yourself or be safe in that relationship. So you'll leave it. So you might leave it behind. And many of us have this tendency. And so this is actually a really cool flip side, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you learn how to set boundaries in your intimate relationships, especially with friends and lovers and all that, you will find that it's actually easier to sustain those relationships through moments of conflict, wildly enough, right? Because you are learning how to have those difficult conversations. We'll talk about the 2 signs in just a sec. I just wanted to say, if this conversation is resonating with you, if you're like, dear God, yes, please, I need some boundaries. How do I do it? You should come hang out tonight at my workshop, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. If you go to my profile and click the link in my bio, it's HaileyMagee.com/workshops. I'm putting it in right here. You can buy the ticket tonight, or you can snag the on-demand recording if you can't make it live. So that is going to be a blast. I always have so much fun at these workshops, and it's great to kind of learn in community. So the link is in there. Something else I kind of wanted to talk about was the third sign you need to set a boundary. And this one is interesting. So hold on to your chairs. It is venting. So here's the thing, right? Many of us vent. I vent when I have a really rough day at work, when I've had a hard conversation with a friend or family member. Sometimes venting is a super cool way to just let off steam, to blow it off, and to just kind of, get back to stasis, right? But here's the catch. Venting, after a certain point, can actually become harmful, because instead of solving the situation that is causing us the need to vent in the first place, we're going over here and we're venting about it all the time. It's like the illusion of relief. It's like the illusion of solving the problem. Oh, well, thank God I just vented about Mary for an hour and I feel so much better. Now I can go deal with her in the workplace. But then the problem is that that's not a sustainable solution, and our problems tend to keep circling up and circling up. So, I'm realizing I'm speaking fast. I'm passionate about this. I'm like, why is venting a signal? But here's the thing, right? What we can do instead is, if you notice that you are consistently venting about the same person or topic or arrangement in your life, that's a sign that clearly something about that person or arrangement is not working for you. And you might benefit by, instead of blowing off your steam to a third party who, let's face it, really can't do anything to solve it, instead you can kind of buck up the courage and kind of summon that chutzpah, right? And go set a boundary or have a conversation about your limits and needs with the person in question, right? And this is true for all things. It's true with friends. It's true with partners and family. It's even true for work. And I know that setting boundaries in the workplace is kind of a whole nother live, right? Because there's power dynamics at play, and there's financial security at play, and there's privilege at play, and all of that stuff. But if you do find yourself consistently venting, it might be worth considering, is there some conversation I can have to better advocate for myself here? Okay. And this actually is similar and different to the final fourth hidden sign that you need to set a boundary, which is triangulation. So what I want you to do, for those of you who aren't familiar with this word from like a therapy context, imagine a triangle, okay? I'm gonna do it with my hands. So let's imagine that we're talking about a family, right? So we've got parent A at the top, we've got parent B down here, and then over here in the corner, we've got the kid, right? So what you'll notice is that if parent A and parent B are consistently having struggles in their relationship, they will occasionally triangulate in the kiddo over here. Raise your hand if you've been this kid, right? And they will vent and talk with the kid about the problems with the other parent, instead of speaking directly with the parent in question and finding a way to resolve the conflict, right? So it creates this more, it's almost like a more stable thing, because the problem is just going around and around in circles. And the person being triangulated into your dynamic, whether it's your child, whether it's your friend, whether it's a mutual acquaintance, this is a difficult position to be in, right? Because the kid is not, they're over here. They're not capable of resolving the conflict between parent A and parent B. And clearly to the comments, right? It's like being parentified, totally. And this dynamic, I use the parent-parent-child triangle because it's really common, but this occurs out of other situations too, right? Like it occurs among friends. Let's say friend A and B are having an issue, so they both complain to friend C about it, right? Another example of triangulation. Now, again, I just want to pause and say, like, within reason, every so often, it's totally normal for us to feel like we can't directly communicate with someone else, and so we'll seek out a third party, maybe for some advice or some perspective. But again, the key here to each of these patterns is if it becomes habitual, if you are consistently triangulating or consistently venting, then it's a sign that you're not actually addressing the problem at the root, right? You're putting a Band-Aid on that instead of putting a boundary on that, which is typically what we really need. And so it's really interesting to notice that whether you've been triangulated or triangulate, whoops, I'm dropping you, right? This is something to be mindful of. And we talk about this extensively at my workshop tonight. Go to my profile, click on the link to join tonight at Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. If you can't make it live, you can also snag the on-demand recording right now to watch whenever you want. I'll send you the link. But I would love to kind of open up the floor for questions. We just talked about the 4 hidden signs you need to set a boundary: avoidance, ghosting, venting, and triangulation. Spooky, hidden. And of course, added to that, like we had talked about before, there are some of the bigger, more obvious ones like resentment, anger, burnout, exhaustion, and others. All of these we'll talk about at the workshop tonight. But go ahead, if you have a question, drop it in the comments. I'll do my best to see it. There's actually a very cool Q&A function here on this live, which I'm still getting accustomed to, where I can see your questions and answer them there. So who has one? Let's talk about it. I'm keeping an eye out. Maybe this topic was just like so straightforward. Everyone's like, no questions. We can just kind of do our thing. I'm here for it if there are, though. Right? Folks, if you're just joining, I will be sharing this live again so that we can all kind of rewatch it as needed. But we just discussed the 4 hidden signs that you need to set a boundary. So they were avoidance, ghosting, triangulation, and venting. And now I see some comments popping in, some questions. So let's see here. What if there is no solution to what you are venting about? Venting is the only solution because the person won't change. Totally. So this is a question, I really appreciate it. So this is a question that's tricky, right? Like if there is a situation in your life that for some reason is not changing, maybe you've tried to set a boundary already and it doesn't work, or maybe you are financially dependent on an employer, so you can't leave the workplace, but that employer just totally sucks and is really mean to you. Then venting can be a helpful way to discharge some of that trapped energy. It can be a way of acknowledging, all right, crap, there's truly nothing I can do about this situation, and for my own mental health, I need to decompress it with someone else. The only thing I'd say here to be a little bit mindful of is that if you find yourself consistently venting to the same people about the same problem, be mindful of that, and be mindful of maybe what's the word I'm looking for? Like spreading out your venting among multiple parties, right? So if you cannot talk to your partner 24/7 about this, right? Maybe you also do some of that venting with a friend, or a therapist or coach would also be a great fit, or some other supports. Because the problem is, if we constantly are venting about the same thing to the same person, that person can begin to feel like our audience or sounding board, and the relationship can become imbalanced. Great question. Thanks for asking. Let's see, another question. Any advice for when you address the issue and the person doesn't receive it well and walks away from the discussion? Yeah, so this is where we get into boundary enforcement, which is another thing we'll be talking about in tonight's workshop, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. You can snag a ticket or catch the on-demand recording at the link in my bio, or go to HaileyMagee.com/workshops. So I think the thing about boundary enforcement is we need to understand what's in our control and what's not, right? So let's imagine that I'm having an issue with someone, and I go up and I set a boundary. You know, it really bothers me when you do such and such thing, please stop. I have control over whether I set that boundary in the first place, but to be honest, I don't have control over how they respond to my boundary. And there are people who, like the question says, don't receive it well. They'll just walk away and keep on doing the same old troubling behavior. This is the critical point where we need to understand what's in our control and what's not. Because the things that are in our control, you can think of it as like your control toolbox, right? What are your options? Those are the only things we can do. And many of us get stuck in this really difficult pattern of thinking, oh, well, I just need to set the boundary a few more times. Or, oh, I just need to explain my boundary better. Then they'll really understand. We're thinking that the person will ultimately understand and accept us if we only find the perfect solution. And frankly, y'all, that's just not the case a lot of the time. People hear us and understand us, they just don't necessarily want to do what we're requesting with our boundary. And then so what's in your control? So to the person who asked this question, you know, you have a difficult neighbor who smokes and doesn't open windows, I would ask you what's in your control there when it comes to your living space, when it comes to maybe talking to, I don't know if there's like a landlord or someone else in the situation here. What's in your control? You can get creative, and then from within that list, you can figure out your next steps. Also, folks, we are going to do a really cool, the workshop tonight closes with an intensive Q&A where you'll have the chance to ask personal questions just like this and get real-time feedback. If you want to join, be sure to come to the workshop tonight, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser, at 5 p.m. Pacific, or if you can't make it live, you can snag the on-demand recording to watch whenever you would like. I'm checking out the questions here. We have some more in the chat. How to approach an ex-wife that is ghosting? Is there any chance? So similar to this question I see here, how do I do this? I am answering this question, haha. Yep, so this is how we do it, right? It really brings us back to the whole idea of control. So to the person who asked this question, if someone is ghosting on you, what is in your control from here, right? If you haven't already, you might express to them how the ghosting makes you feel and what you hope to gain from a reconnection. Beyond that, in some ways, a person ghosting, there's not much we can do to really get back in touch with that person. They have to be willing to connect with us. We can't make them do the thing they don't want to do. And so sometimes that ends with us needing to respect their boundary for time and space. What else we got here? How to handle the smear campaigns that sometimes come up when you set a boundary. This is so real. I see your name, Sleepy House Healing. Let's give this person some love, because many of us have been on the receiving end of this situation, right? We finally are like, I'm breaking the people-pleasing pattern, baby. I'm going to start speaking my truth, setting these hard boundaries, asserting my limits. I'm not going to pretend anymore, right? And then we do the hard thing, like set the boundary, whether it's with a family system or with a friend or a partner. And all of a sudden, we get unbelievable amounts of pushback, whether it's people or communities telling us that we're selfish, telling us that we're demanding, telling us that we're cold-hearted, and that is a lot to hold. I just want to honor that, because it's really, really hard. I've been there just this year. I'm sure like literally almost everyone watching this has been in a similar situation. And in those moments, what's most important for us to do, and also really hard, is that we have to pause and use what I call guilt resiliency. Because we might be slowly internalizing what they're saying about us, right? God, am I selfish? Am I cold-hearted? Like, am I being just a total asshole right now? So what we need to learn to do is privilege our own reality. And remember, there are a couple tips. I have a whole workshop on this, but I'll sort of give you a couple tips now. The first thing is, remember, like, or how do I say this? The first tip is like, imagine what would happen if you had not set the boundary. This is one of my favorite tools, right? So we set a boundary, there's really bad pushback, it sucks, we feel like crap. That's really hard. But then you can imagine, all right, well, what if I hadn't set the boundary? What if I went for another 6 months or year or 5 years and never changed or addressed this toxic thing happening in my life? It's a scary visualization exercise because oftentimes when we imagine not setting that boundary and we see all the potential icky stuff that could come from that, we're able to say, all right, granted, it's really hard right now, but thank God I ripped off this Band-Aid and I did this. Because if I hadn't, we can see all the negative repercussions that would have come up. And then another thing I like to share to this question of how do you handle the smear campaign is we don't live in a vacuum, right? I could say like, well, you just have to buck up and trust yourself and yada yada, but we're social beings. And sometimes we all require a little bit of external validation or, what's the word I'm looking for? Support, my goodness, support from other people who trust us. And so if you're really struggling after being the victim of like a smear campaign or judgment after setting a boundary, identify one or more people in your life, friends, close people, even a therapist, who can work with you to acknowledge that by setting this boundary, you really took care of yourself and did what you needed to do. Because like you're exactly in the comments, we need connection and we all need support sometimes. And I just want to reiterate, y'all, for those of you who are finding this conversation interesting and would like real-time practice strengthening your boundary setting muscle and speaking your truth, you should come hang out tonight at Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser, my virtual workshop. I am dropping the link to that in the comments. If you can't come live, you can also snag the on-demand recording to watch at your leisure. Let me see here. I'm looking through the questions. I know some of you have actually dropped them in the... I'll probably answer one more here. So let's see. I hope you like my singing. Okay, let's do this one. How do I pin you? Ha! Pin comment. I'm still learning, y'all. Thank you so much for being patient with me while I sort of learn to navigate this live. It's kind of fun and a little bit intimidating all at once, but I really like it. So how do you not get overly emotional and keep cool while setting a boundary? I really like this question, and there are a couple of key tips I'd love to kind of share with you to talk about that. I also pinned my comment with the workshop tonight for Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser, where you can visit that. So there are a couple of key tricks that I like to use when I'm preparing to set a boundary, because if you're anything like me, fellow recovering people pleaser, sometimes the thought of setting a boundary, especially a tricky one, like with a best friend or a boss or a partner, I get like the racing chest, I get the like quick breaths. I'm just like, oh God, I'm so nervous about this. So there are a couple of things you can do. The first thing is go and pause, like in a space, whether it's like a bathroom or a bedroom, and literally imagine and write down the words you would say if you were to set this boundary perfectly in your integrity. I am a huge fan of scripts, especially for the recovering people pleaser who is just now learning how to do this. And so I kid you not, this is how big a nerd I am. There have been times where I've gotten my little cards and written down some notes for myself about the boundary and like brought that card into the conversation. Call it awkward, call it nerdy, call it whatever you want. But sometimes having a thing that we can rely on when we're having these really difficult conversations really helps, right? I know it's silly, but it works for me. Another way to kind of work with this is also remembering to kind of practice regulating your nervous system before and during the boundary conversation. Okay, so ways we can do this, and you have heard these before, right? Oh, and thanks for the kind words, Janessa, about the workshop, by the way. Thank you. But really regulating regulating your nervous system is so important. Before you have a conversation, breathe deep, right into your belly, hold that breath, and then let it out. Right? You might be thinking, this is so basic, deep breathing, really? But there's a reason these things are cliche and repeated over and over. It's because they really work. So before and during the conversation, be mindful of your breathing. And something else that can really help that I've noticed a lot is this way of setting boundaries called radical transparency. I have a post about this somewhere. We talk about this approach extensively at the workshop tonight. I've pinned a comment where you can get the link and snag your tickets now. But basically, radical transparency is a way of setting boundaries that acknowledges the complexity of the feelings you're having. So I'm going to use radical transparency in an example because it's easier to show than to explain. Let's imagine I'm about to set a boundary with a friend about needing some more time alone. And I'm afraid of hurting her feelings, and it's making me so freaking nervous, right? I might go into this conversation using radical transparency and say something like, hey, Mary, I'm a little bit nervous about this conversation, but there's something I want to share with you because I've really been trying lately to take better care of myself. And so while it's hard for me to say this, I wanted to let you know that I need a little bit more time to myself. Are you open to talking with me about what that could look like? Right, so that was just off the cuff. But you'll notice there, what makes radical transparency unique is that it gives you permission to say how you're feeling in the boundary setting moment without pretending to be some fearlessly confident, I got this, no worries, because that doesn't feel real. It feels like a performance. And the last thing we need when we're already having a hard conversation about boundaries is feeling stage fright to maintain this performance, this facade of this perfectly confident, fearless person that we don't feel like in the moment. Plus, if we're about to have a conversation with someone we somewhat trust, right? So like a family member or a friend or a partner, it can open up a lot of intimacy and honesty to say I'm nervous about this conversation. And I'm aware that this could hurt you, and I want to be mindful of that. I'm trying to take better care of myself, so here's what I need. Let's talk about it. Right? That can just feel so much more authentic. And we talk all about different communication styles you can use to set and assert your boundaries at tonight's workshop, Empowered Boundaries for the Recovering People Pleaser. I have pinned the comment here where you can snag a ticket to the event tonight at 5 p.m. Pacific, or if you can't make it, you can also snag the on-demand recording that you can watch anytime, so it'll just be there for you. So go ahead, hop to my website and find that stuff. Otherwise, I'm gonna rock and roll. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for the excellent questions, and I can't wait to see some of you tonight at the workshop. Take care.